Pakistan International Financial Center. Given the urgency and severity of climate change, I think it's easy to overlook the progress that's been made to date. A record level of investments is going into clean energy, exceeding oil and gas for the first time. This is in turn driving unsubsidized costs below those of conventional sources of power. We've also seen innovation, however, in the financial markets with the rapid rise of new financial products such as green bonds, green insurance, and new risk mitigation tools to mobilize private capital. And we've also seen deeper integration of environmental and climate considerations into business processes and decision-making, be it green standards, climate-related risk assessments, or specific green investment mandates among pension and asset management communities. So there's a great deal to talk about this morning, and I wanted to start on an optimistic note. We have a very fine panel, as you can see here this morning, and starting us off is Governor Kilometov, who really needs little introduction. One of the most experienced economic and public figures here in Kazakhstan, and currently overseeing the ambitious new project of Astana International Financial Center. Governor Kilometov.
Thank you very much for these great opportunities to talk to the distinguished panel. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's really very much important that today's session we are talking about how to really to implement the commitments which was done by the government of Kazakhstan in terms of the Paris COP21 conference agenda. And I believe that the theme of the expo, which we are now hosting since this week and up to the September 10, is also future energy. So everyone in Kazakhstan, in a level of central government, local governance, and also the public realize that this is really urgent call to think about this, and we need a long-term strategy, we need a vision, and we need also the action plan. And I believe that part of this activity is the work which we are doing like AAFC, Astana International Financial Center, jointly with EBRD, and we actually create a very distinguished team of experts who are helping us to develop a master plan or conceptual papers for the creating of the green financial system in Kazakhstan. So let me briefly explain you the role of AAFC in terms of the future development of Kazakhstan. So we are very well known like oil-rich country. I think was quite successful the previous decade in economic growth, but the recent development in commodities markets show us actually two very important I think factors which influence to us. One is that the entire paradigm shifting to non-hydrocarbon world and the agreement of the global agreement in terms of the movement to the new international global standards in terms of the environment and sustainable development, like sustainable development goals or Paris conference commitments from one side. And from the other side, we see that in the practical terms, the, let's say, the volatility on commodities, especially in the oil market, is not like a temporary event like it was in previous. It's really kind of the changing in terms of the new factors such as like shale oil, new shale oil factor in the United States, or the slowdown in Chinese economy, which is finalized the super cycle of commodities. So these are kind of the two main trends, mega trends, let's say, which influence to the opinion of the central government actually really start to be smooth.
Яғни осындай әртүрлі үрдістер болып жатыр, әртүрлі елдерде үкіметтер жасыл экономикаға ауысып жатыр. Және біздің байқағанымыз, біздің үкіметіміздің 2050 жылға дейін осы қайта қалпына келетін энергия көздерінің мөлшерлемесі 50%-ға дейін жету керек. Енді Қазақстан үшін қазба байлықтарына, қазба отына не
move to the new dimensions. So in these terms, we are like AFC itself is very much committed to the sustainable development. We actually very much appreciate to the team of experts who are led by Katulus, and we would like to let today's much more to the participants of these sessions, what we are doing, what is our next stages. We believe that till the end of this year it will be already second phase of our project, when we will really kind of bring the master plan, roadmap and conceptual papers. So thank you.
Special Representative for Central Asia with us. Prior to taking up his role as Special Representative, Ambassador Burian served as State Secretary and Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs of the Slovak Republic. Previously, he served as Ambassador to the U.S. in Washington, Permanent Representative to the United Nations in New York, and also to NATO. So thank you, Ambassador Burian.
Good morning, and thank you for a nice introduction. Dear Governor Kalimbetov, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to take part in this important discussion on the green financing and investment in light of implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change. I really wanted to comment Astana Financial Center Authority for organizing the discussion, and I appreciate a very clear vision as was presented by Governor, and I feel also this is a clear testimony that Astana Financial Center feels where the opportunities are. And I believe this discussion is very timely, and we cannot imagine a better background for it than Astana Expo 2017 with its focus on future energy. And here I wish to congratulate our Kazakh friends on its successful inauguration. And we are pleased to know that since the very beginning already, Expo has been generating ideas on how to contribute to sustainable development of the world, including through green investment, green technologies, decarbonization of energy mix, low emission mobility, energy efficiency investments, and other measures which are so crucial for the success of Paris Agreement. And I think also Expo is really a very good opportunity for discussing how to involve new innovative approaches and technologies presented here in Astana by individual countries and companies. Ladies and gentlemen, last week I have attended Central Asia Environmental Forum in Ashgabat, where all participants from the region, but also from international organizations, highlighted the importance of full and speedy implementation of Paris Agreement for mitigating a rapidly growing impact of climate change. Asia is one of the most vulnerable regions to the climate change on the Euro-Asian continent, but also on the other hand, Central Asia and individual countries have also a huge potential to the mitigation of climate change impact. That is why the European Union has identified the cooperation with the Central Asian countries on climate change and sustainable development as one of the key priorities of our EU Central Asia strategy. And I'm privileged to discuss and see how we can speed up the process of its implementation with our partners. We just recently met in Bishkek, will be meeting soon on the ministerial level in Samarkand, and really I have to say climate change impact is highly on the agenda. We have been already, as European Union and individual member countries of the EU, implementing more than 50 projects and programs worth more than 250 million euros in the area of environment and sustainable water management in individual countries of Central Asia. But once again, more should be done, we believe, to strengthen the cooperation and regional ownership of efforts. And I see a very important ready from our side to share our experience and technologies as well as financial instruments. And I would be eager to listen how you see this opportunity for players like EU to contribute to shaping important tools and mechanisms. And we already have at our disposal instruments like IFCA, Central Asia Invest, but also I believe we need to encourage European Investment Bank to be more active in the region, and they are already in Kazakhstan and in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan supporting green economy and green technologies implementation. We also want to increase synergy and complementarity of action with other players and in particular international organizations like UN and OECD to really improve synergy and complementarity of our action. And we believe improved energy efficiency can greatly contribute to saving money, to enhancing energy security, and to reducing greenhouse emissions. Last Monday, for your information, Vice President of EU Commission, Mr. Šefčovič, during his meeting with Prime Minister Sagintayev in Astana, agreed also to fully use existing mechanisms of bilateral and regional cooperation, including recently signed agreement, enhanced partnership and cooperation agreement between EU and Kazakhstan, and to use it for intensified interaction on this matter. They agreed that joint climate action is also an economic opportunity for both the EU and Kazakhstan, rather than only a threat. And here I would like to say that the move to renewable energy sources and energy efficient buildings is already happening, and it is generating new jobs and growth in Europe. In this respect, it is worth mentioning that the European Union continues successfully decouple its economic growth from its GHG emissions. During the period from 1990 to 2015, the EU's combined GDP grew by 50%, while total GHG emissions decreased by 22%. And here, based on our own experience, we are convinced that saving the climate and saving money can go hand in hand. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to use this opportunity and reconfirm our commitment to implementation of Paris Agreement. The EU is playing its full part in its implementation, both domestically and through commitment to global solidarity. The decision to channel 40% of the European Fund for Strategic Investment towards climate-related projects is a very good example of how we are aligning our financial instruments to deliver on Paris commitments. But we, as I mentioned previously, we want to also strengthen our solidarity with our partners. And that's why, once again, I will be very much interested in listening to your suggestion how we can do it more efficiently. And here, once again, I see an important place for International Financial Center in Astana. We believe the center may become, in the near future, important hub for financial operations and activities, supporting investment and financing of green economy in the region, in line with important suggestions and ideas which will be coming from Expo 2017. So once again, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I wish your discussion, your forum, very big success. And also I wish Expo to be this kind of moment of change in our future. Thank you very much.
Very clear overview of European Union's commitments, activities and contributions to the region. Now I understand that Governor Kilometov might have to leave us, but before he does, I have a question for you to follow up. The vision was very clear and I think we can see the direction of travel, but I would like to address that after some very early and rapid progress towards the green economy transition, things have seemed to have slowed in recent years due to, let's say, tightening economic conditions. I would like to follow up and ask whether the political commitment is there to see that the green economy transition through, number one. And number two, what would you like most, what are you expecting most from your international partners to assist in this process?
So first of all, I would like to confirm the Parliament and the government to succeed in terms of our transition. So I believe that all the concepts and strategies which were adopted on the central government level already in place. You are right in terms of it was like recent influence of the crisis to Kazakhstan, and it was some kind of you've seen like a volatility with exchange rate, and then we move into also to the free float, to inflation targeting, free float on exchange rate, also influenced to some particular projects which were kind of in a pipeline of the government because of the kind of the concerns of the investors, what happened with the financial models. But I think that nowadays we even more realize how important to start this transition. And I think that this Expo 2017 Global Affair is a real commitment. It's kind of global commitment, double confirmation of the willingness of Kazakhstan really deliver this movement. In spite for example, the new US administration is not now committed to the Paris COP21. Now, let me on behalf of the government to confirm this commitment on the Paris Agreement. Number two is that we are on a very early stage with very low indicators and very modest performance, let's say, in terms of the green economy. And here is definitely the European Union is a benchmark for us. So any country in the European Union is real kind of a very good story. That's why we actually host Expo and provide opportunities to all the members of the Bureau of Exhibition, which is more than 100 countries. So all European countries has opportunities to present their achievements. And this is very much important to see for members of the government, for members of the quasi-government sector, of the national companies, people of Kazakhstan, how already we achieved which results, and we understand that. So this is what we are now seeing here is the latest edition, but it's already kind of, we know that is already new achievement in technologies, new movement. What we would like is really kind of to leapfrog to new destination, and I think that the new technologies allow us to do it. The only important moment is just we need a partnership. We need a partnership with all the institutions of UN. We're working very closely with UNDP partnership, all the particular institutions responsible for the sustainable development in EU, especially the financial organizations like EBRD, like European Investment Bank, and all the private sectors companies which are really focused and can help to the Kazakhstan to achieve these results. Our role is to create ecosystem, to create kind of the X-road for the further development, and we would be appreciated if the company will come and share the experience, share best practice, and recommend us really what is a kind of a quick way to achieve good results. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Kilometov. Now I'd like to call upon Mr. Marcel Allers. Mr. Allers is the Global Head of Energy, Infrastructure, Transport and Technology team at one of Kazakhstan's important partners, the United Nations Development Program. And before joining UNDP, Marcel was at the African Development Bank, also with a special focus on energy and infrastructure. Mr. Allers.
Thank you, Katolis. Let me start by thanking the organizers and the government of Kazakhstan for inviting me to share some thoughts on this topic of green finance and investment. So as just mentioned by Katolis, so I oversee UNDP's work globally in the area of sustainable energy, including transport. UNDP has been very active in this area for a long time. We have been doing this for decades, particularly in green financing, using actively the different sources of climate finance, the Global Environment Facility, more recently the Green Climate Fund. We also have participated actively in the carbon finance markets when they were still going strong under the Kyoto Protocol, and we are very keen to see a re-emergence of activity under the new Paris Agreement and on that area, and the need for carbon pricing and the need for sustainable market mechanisms, as is called for under Article 6 of the agreement. I will not further elaborate on that part. I would like to focus my remarks on a number of broader issues about a framework that UNDP has been developing to better understand the lack of investment going into sustainable energy options in developing countries. So as already mentioned by many before me, achieving the Paris Agreement really requires very urgent action. I think everybody agrees on this. And it will include and it will need a transition in the energy systems, given that over 2/3 of emissions are coming from the sector, energy. And so it's not going fast enough. The recent data that come out, for example, out of the global tracking framework that is linked to the SDG process, in particular SDG 7 on energy, clearly indicates that we are not going fast enough. Also, analysis done by UNEP on the GAP report, we're falling short of the commitments needed to really achieve the agreement. Now, what is needed in this transition is clear that it's going to require massive amount of financing capital. The debate often seems to be on the volume of financing. We like to say that it's really not so much a matter of capital. The capital does exist. The capital markets are abundantly capitalized. There's literally trillions in assets waiting to be allocated in productive investments. But for some reason, it is not going where we want it to go. Not going into the sustainable energy options, and certainly not in developing countries, at least not fast enough. So from our point of view, it's really important to understand why that is. Why is it not going there? And in trying to do so, we started developing about five years ago, looking at our own experience with large-scale on-grid wind, trying to understand the drivers for investors and taking an investor perspective of how do investors decide where to allocate capital and what determines those decisions, and to maybe better understand why it is not happening. So we then focused, and I will say a few things on things really related to large-scale on-grid renewable energy investments. And then I will say in the second part a little bit on smaller scale distributed renewable energy assets and energy efficiency. So the analysis that we have undertaken and the framework developed is based on a comparison of levelized cost of electricity and of unsubsidized prices in developed markets and in developing markets. And the major difference, in particular where large project finance structures are being used, like large-scale on-grid investments, the key difference between a developed and a developing market is the level of risk. the level of risk tends to be much more, much higher, either perceived or real, and gets priced into the cost of financing. All things considered equal, the major difference is the cost in financing, which shoots up in a high-risk environment. And making these investments, which have become competitive, cost competitive in a developed market, highly uncompetitive in an environment like Kazakhstan. So that's the key concept. You then need to understand a very detailed understanding of the barriers, the risk, the impact on the cost of financing, and then trying to understand what are these underlying drivers of risk, trying to quantify that risk, see how it contributes to the cost of financing, so that you can then really start targeting and taking very tailored interventions that can address these various risks and barriers. Now for that, excuse me, the framework that we have basically says that there's basically a combination of three things that you can do. You can try to permanently address the underlying drivers of risk and remove them by undertaking policy measures or regulatory measures or building capacity or providing a long-term renewable energy target or that sort of thing. These tend to be soft interventions, technical assistance, grant-based. We call that policy de-risking. That is usually not enough to trigger investment, so you would need to then still see that to maybe transfer part of the risk that the private sector is unwilling to take or only at an unaffordable cost to the public sector. We think that's really the domain of the international financial institutions, the development banks, that really come and play here and can provide instruments like guarantees, loan guarantees, credit risk guarantees, subsidized lending, public lending in general. In some cases, that's enough. You brought down the risk sufficiently, and with that, the cost to make your investment viable, and it goes ahead. In many cases, it still isn't enough. So any residual risk, you have to compensate for. And this is through the typical financial incentives, tax credits, carbon credits, premiums on feed-in tariffs, and that sort of thing. So if you look at things, usually it's a combination of these three things. Very importantly, and I think this is a message that we really like to emphasize over and over again, is that the way you structure your interventions is very, our concern should be to do it in the most cost-effective manner. Because our models show very clearly that it's most cost-effective to invest initially in policy and financial de-risking, taking public measures with public funding, either grant-based or lower-cost non-grant financing, before engaging in incentives. Unfortunately, in reality, very often people jump immediately to incentives. This is a very expensive way of getting things going. Also, incentives do not solve the underlying risk. So if you stop them, everything goes back to normal. So this is something really important to understand. Now, just to close up here, a few results that we just came up with. We've done an analysis here in Kazakhstan, trying to look at the large-scale on-grid renewable energy sector. There's a report that is not, we couldn't get it ready in time to launch it here this week, but we'll try to do it over the summer, later on in the year. But I'd like to share a couple of key findings in there. And UNDP, just so people know, we have been an early actor here. We had a very early wind project, did some wind mapping, and laid the foundations for the future investment that we're currently seeing to start pick up. For example, actors like the EBRD, very active here, and understand they recently closed an additional investment here. So our report indicates that to achieve in the short term, 5-year, 1 gigawatt target for wind by 2021, that an investment of about $275 million in public de-risking measures, a combination of policy and mostly financial de-risking, can leverage about $1.6 billion in private investment. It can generate more than $1 billion in economic savings over the next 20 years. It increases the affordability by lowering the generation cost, dropping the cost of generation from 9.2 to 7.1 cents per kilowatt hour, a savings that could be passed on to the consumer, and generate 56 million tons in carbon credits over the next, in emission reduction, sorry, in the next 20 years. So that was all on large-scale wind. We also, and more importantly, and increasingly work on smaller, renewable energy-based distributed solutions and assets. For that, and in the context of this forum here today, or the session might be of interest to the audience, is that we are putting in place right now, and it's going live next month, a climate aggregation platform where we're trying to promote the scale-up of financial aggregation or for small-scale, low-carbon energy assets in developing countries. We're doing this in partnership with the Climate Bonds Initiative and the Inter-American Development Bank. The EIB has been a partner in this discussion, and they are on the board of that initiative. It will work on standardization and addressing tax and regulatory barriers in a number of pilot countries. It will target small-scale renewable energy-based assets and energy efficiency investments through pooling and financial aggregation in an attempt to lower the financing cost, which is the long-term goal, to tap eventually into the bond markets long-term. That is a few bridges too far in our assessment in the countries where we work in, but in a short-term target, it could be to maybe head for some refinancing at lower costs, etc. So we work in Kenya, in India, and in several Latin American countries, and possibly we could decide to choose to do something here in Kazakhstan or in Central Asia too. So maybe I should leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. And I have to say, quite compelling headline results. So I think we're all looking forward to seeing a copy of that report when it's available. Next is Ian Henderson, Head of International Cooperation, also at one of the UN organizations, the UN Environment Programme's Inquiry into the Design of a Sustainable Financial System, which seeks to advance financial policy options that mobilize capital for an inclusive green economy. So, Ian, thank you.
And good morning, everyone. And I'd like to extend my thanks to our kind host for the invite to be here today. So my exam question, as it were, relates to greening the capital markets, and specifically why it's important and how is this happening. So to speak to the first of those questions, why is greening the capital markets important? I want to make a couple of observations. So the first is, as we've already heard, this represents an enormous opportunity. This opportunity doesn't respect national or even regional boundaries. I think that's important to point out. So as we heard from the ambassador and the governor this morning, the last 18 months have seen a new set of policy foundations laid down that set a direction for the world economy. We've effectively had a signal, a bold signal for a new direction for the financial system. World leaders have agreed to sustainable development goals and have ratified the Paris Agreement on climate change. And this, in essence, plots out an annual investment pipeline that's measured in the trillions of dollars. And these all address social and environmental issues. So to achieve these goals, as we've already heard several times, is going to require an unprecedented amount of money. And that unprecedented amount of money represents a unique opportunity for the financial system. We're talking about $90 trillion over the next 15 years. So we know that these global policy foundations have been laid down. So the next step is the practical task of thinking about how we mobilize that money. We've already heard this morning that the funds that are flowing are basically wholly inadequate. And so in order to mobilize and reallocate those funds, we're going to need to green capital markets. Capital markets are a major artery of the financial system. The second reason that capital markets are important, and this is with the caveat that there is no silver bullet, is they provide a number of levers to deliver sustainable development. So a fundamental problem with capital markets is that they misallocate capital level of sustainability, and that's because of inefficiencies and also because of market failures. And this can lead to two impacts. Activities that would deliver a positive environmental result don't come to fruition because the capital isn't available. So broadly speaking, through the lens of sustainability, capital markets can do three things. So firstly, they can raise capital for sustainable uses. Secondly, they can move capital, shift capital from less sustainable to more sustainable activities by adjusting the cost of capital and doing that by addressing inefficiencies and failures. And third, through capital markets, you can harness the stewardship capabilities of investors, and this is generally through the ownership rights associated with certain type of equities. So there are a bunch of reasons about why we should green capital markets, why we should green capital markets. And the second bit is why is this already happening? This is the second part of the question. So I think there's a growing voice that would back the notion that the economic system of today is in part broken. That there's a lot of good news around, and we've heard some of it this morning. But there are major failings in the system which manifest themselves in different ways. So to give you some example, every single year there are 6.5 million premature deaths from pollution linked to our global energy system. 21 of the world's 37 largest aquifers have gone beyond their sustainability tipping point. The World Meteorological Organization announced in, I think, March this year that 2016, last year, was the warmest year on record, 1.1 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. And NASA have calculated that 9 out of the 10 warmest years on record have taken place since the year 2000. So effectively, if you want to change the economic system, you have to change the financial system, as that is the cornerstone of it. And if we want to change the financial system, we need to move from this mentality of incrementalism to one of system change. We need to think about greening the system, not just about individual projects. So it's very important to think about greening capital markets at a sort of higher level. And I think on this point, it's interesting to note that finance is one of the few sectors that you could argue has been given a free ride through a sustainability lens. If you think of other sectors through the lens of sustainability, we don't think of cars, but we think of mobility systems. We don't think of solar panels, but we think of energy systems. And I think we need to adopt that mentality to the world of finance and start thinking about finance systems to bring about change we need in the time and at the scale available. I think a second reason that we're seeing greening of the capital markets is the more effective and efficient interplay between public and private sectors. And I think the green bond story, which we have heard about and undoubtedly will hear more about, is a great story of change. It was catalyzed by development banks who made a few demonstration issues that built capacity and confidence. And then the reason it scaled was an interplay between private innovation and public enterprise. We saw private market-based actors coming up with principles and guidelines and providing the demand. But at the same time, there was regulatory frameworks created by China and India and others, definitions created, typologies. And as I say, it wasn't just one group of actors, it was the effective interplay between a bunch which helped scale. A final reason that capital markets are becoming green is that sustainability more broadly and green issues are effectively becoming a competitive factor in the world's financial centers. So obviously we've heard about the AIFC, but we're also seeing the same thing in Paris, in London, in Marrakesh, in Singapore and Nairobi. And financial centers are experimenting and thinking about how to develop the rules, the incentives, and the market-based activities to green their financial centers. And the G7 last week at a meeting that I understand Alessandro was attending acknowledged the pivotal role that financial centers are going to play in sustainable finance. In Italy, just last Thursday, I think, offered to host the very first meeting to try and understand how financial centers can cooperate and make sustainability a pre-competitive issue. So I think in the interest of time, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. I think after some early optimism, you've brought us back down to earth, but we do know, I think we have a clear idea of why this discussion is important. So next we turn to Simon Buckle, who is the head of the Climate, Biodiversity and Water Division at the OECD. Simon.
So thank you very much for the introduction, Catullus. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to take part. I should get going. We've heard a lot about Paris, about green finance, so you'll have to excuse me that I'm going to improvise my remarks because some of it's been covered already. But let me start by saying that the last 60 years of economic development on this planet have seen an unprecedented human impact on the natural systems that underpin life on Earth. That's the climate, that's water, that's land, that's the forests, biodiversity, you name it. Any indicator you choose, we're making huge and damaging changes to our planet. And we haven't got another one. We need a different growth model to give us sustainable growth over the longer term. So I just wanted to highlight an OECD report that came out a couple of weeks ago called Investing in Climate, Investing in Growth, where we make the case that you can have economic well-being and decisive action on climate at the same time. So I recommend you have a look at that if you get a chance. The scale of risks we face if we don't take action is enormous, as we've heard from Ambassador Burian. The risks in Central Asia will be from extreme weather. Remember the 2010 extreme summer in Russia that destroyed, 25% of the wheat crop? Think about your water resources, think about your land. Somebody mentioned the decision by the US government to pull out of the Paris Agreement, so I'm just going to, if you'll excuse me, rehearse a little bit of the history of the talks to make clear why what we have now is actually the result of painstaking discussions over 20 years. It's not something you can just throw up and start again in an instant, and we haven't got time to delay. So the climate agreement, the framework convention that was agreed in 1992, aims at stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous, anthropogenic, that's human, interference with the climate system. We started off with a very sharp distinction between developed and developing countries. The developing countries had a focus on growth and development. The developed countries were meant to take all the mitigation action, reduce the emissions. Of course, that approach would not work in the world today. We were talking about a world then where the developed countries emitted 60% of the emissions, developing countries maybe 40%. That's completely reversed. You've had a complete global transformation. And that was recognized in a sense by the Copenhagen Agreement in 2009, which was thought by many as a failure, but actually marked the start of a new approach where we had governments working to make contributions bottom up, but then establish a top-down mechanism for assessment, review, and updating of their commitments. And that's what we have with Paris. That's the culmination of 20 years of international efforts. Now, we all know that those commitments from countries at the moment are not good enough. Ambassador Burian mentioned that. But Paris has these mechanisms so that countries can progressively update their action over time. And the first stage of that will be the facilitative dialogue, so-called, that will take place in 2018. One of the Paris objectives is obviously to limit temperature changes, another is to increase the resilience of economies, and the third is to make finance flows consistent with the pathways towards those low emissions future. So that's what I shall turn to now, given that this is a green finance conference. In our recent study, we actually updated the figure that Ian quoted of about 90 trillion that's needed to 2030. It's about 103, we think, to meet the Paris goals. That's 6.3 trillion a year, broadly across the globe. Yes, there's plenty of money there. Institutional investors have about that money, 100 trillion sitting there, but a very small fraction of that is invested in infrastructure and an even smaller fraction invested in green infrastructure. So we need to create the conditions that allow them to do this, as we've also heard from UNDP. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to create the right policy and regulatory infrastructure. We need to reduce risks, yes. We need to also think about the enabling environment, our competition policy, our policy on inward investment, policy on licensing and permitting for new power generation plants, for example. And we also need to use all these new tools and mechanisms that are being mentioned at the moment: green investment banks, green bonds, the multilateral development banks playing a huge role in this. And you'll recall that the Paris Agreement reaffirmed the 100 billion commitment that was made back in 2009, 2010 for developed countries to help developing countries take climate action. And the development banks have pledged to double their financial flows in regard to that commitment. So that's a very, very positive, very important role that they will play. I think the key thing to underline is this initial step of the transformation around the energy system is actually probably the most easy part of the problem. We've got technologies that are falling in cost rapidly. Solar down 80% over perhaps 5 or 6 years. In India recently there was an auction for solar, and it came in cheaper than coal. So it's cheaper than new coal in India. I'm sure it is in Kazakhstan too, with the solar resource you have here. It was also cheaper, and you have to think that existing coal plants, you know, the costs are sunk. You can just keep running them basically on the cost of the coal that you mine. But that solar PV auction in India was also cheaper than quite a bit of the existing coal generation capacity in India too. So I'd say that one of the main challenges to establishing green finance in Kazakhstan and Central Asia is actually to make sure you have a project pipeline of green projects, and you can think very much in terms of renewables here, as the Governor mentioned earlier. A lot of your coal plants are over 30 years old, are very inefficient, and they are an easy win in terms of technical change. Clearly there are social and employment dimensions to that need to be handled too, but there are some very straightforward things technically that could be done to meet Kazakhstan's own commitments under the Paris Agreement and boost the green finance and the new centre. I think I'd like to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your patience.
Thank you, Simon, on what needs to be done. This input has been very helpful to our Green Financial System for Kazakhstan project, and OECD has certainly been a very reliable partner for Kazakhstan over the years. Next, though, we turn to Alessandro Farrugia, an award-winning journalist and writer for Quotidiano Nazionale, based in Rome, and a long time covering climate change. Alessandro.
I want to thank for the organizers for the invitation. My contribution will be about my country, Italy. 2016 was the hottest year on record, not to mention the widespread pollution. It was a bad year for environment, but was a quite good year for green finance. The previous years planted good seeds. The Sustainable Development Goal and the Paris Agreement require a new generation of innovations from the financial system. And governments, at least until the election of Donald Trump, are moving in this direction. Last year, for the first time, G20 heads of state recognized the need to scale up green finance. Last week, the G7 environment in Bologna repeated the concept, saying that scaling up sustainable finance is fundamental to achieve sustainability and climate goals. There is a growing momentum to mobilize private capital for sustainable development, but more action, much more action is needed. What the state can do to accelerate this process? I think that Italy is an interesting case study. Italy National Dialogue for Sustainable Finance was launched by the Ministry of Environment in February 2016 in partnership with the UN Environment. And to take stock of existing practice, identify key challenges and suggest policy options to take promising development to scale. The dialogue demonstrated that a shift is already underway and identified a number of signs of momentum across Italy's banking, capital markets, insurance, investments, and public finance sector. These are some. According to the Banks and Green Economy report led by ABI, Italy's banks have lent 27 billion euros between 2007 and 2014 for renewable energy, including 18 billion for solar. Investment in energy efficiency, notably in the building sector, has also a high potential. In 2016, ranking of sustainability disclosure on 45 stock exchanges, Borsa Italiana climbed 11 places to the 19th position. And in terms of revenues from listed companies involved in the green economy, the Borsa Italiana ranks 10th among global stock exchanges. In addition, a number of innovative instruments have been launched to encourage small and medium enterprises to access capital markets. Currently, Italy has 738 billion in bonds that are aligned with actions on climate change. In 2015, 616 billion in assets under management were managed according to a range of sustainable and responsible investment strategies, which is about 6% of the European total. Over 22% of Italy's insurance market is covered by companies that have signed the UN Principle for Sustainable Insurance. And Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, which is Italy's national promotional bank, has placed sustainable development at the heart of its new business plan. These are promising developments, however, have not yet achieved a systematic impact across the financial mainstream in Italy. Specific further actions are needed, and the national dialogue, has identified 18 separate options. The first suggestion is that the government should set a comprehensive national agenda that will enhance the role of finance as a driver for sustainable development. One of the three pillars of the Green Act, which is currently under discussion in the Italian Parliament, focus on this exact point. Another action is that the CDP could systematize its sustainable development mandating into consistent policies and processes and strengthen its accountability towards all the stakeholders. Tax expenditures could be reviewed to remove progressively, but with speed and certainty, the environmentally harmful subsidies in the energy sector. Banca d'Italia and other market regulators could use their database and their knowledge to evaluate the implications of climate change for Italy economy and financial system and suggest measures to encourage good practice by financial institutions. Italy could include green finance as an essential part of its cooperation activities with developing countries, as has been done through the microfinance green schemes. A new effort is also needed to identify a mechanism for complementing traditional sources of bank credit for small and medium enterprises operating in the green economy with other more sophisticated financial instruments that allow a longer-term view. The government also could take the opportunity of the Piano Casa, which is another act, to encourage significant investments in the quality of buildings, in particular the energy efficiency of residential, commercial, and public buildings. I think this is an issue which is very interesting also for Kazakhstan. Another suggestion is to establish a green bond development committee, including public and private entities, to identify and deliver the critical steps needed to develop the market. The government and the insurance companies could also explore a national scheme to cover risks from climate-related natural catastrophes, in particular for residential properties. And the government, along with financial institutions, could leverage the role of Italy in the Mission Innovation Initiative to scale up private capital for breakthrough sustainable technologies. Borsa Italiana, also the stock exchange, the Italian stock exchange, could take further action to increase the level of transparency and facilitate the engagement of responsible investors. I think that the EU non-financial reporting directive could provide a first step toward improving transparency and prepare the way for responding to the recommendation of the FSB task force. All institutional investors could publicly report on how environmental, social, and governance factors impact their portfolios and how they are supporting the climate transition. The Italian Corporate Governance Committee could further strengthen the focus on the importance of sustainability issues for the long-term value creation, and a collaborative consortium of financial institutions, academics, and public authorities could be established to pilot environmental stress testing models. Also very important is an information campaign that should be launched to highlight the importance of environmental threats and the role that consumers and investors can play in influencing the supply side of the market. Financial institutions could identify the skills needed to make their professionals green finance literate and incorporate this into training programs. The government could also encourage the development of a model for measuring the progress of the financial system towards sustainable developments. These are concrete options, many of them interesting not only for Italy. Progress on this could make a material difference in closing the gap across the key financial sector and issues. I think Italy will move in this direction, and I'm sure that also the rest of the world, including Kazakhstan, probably will and should. Thank you.
A very interesting case study, and thank you for the suggestions. In the interest of time, because I'd like to leave some room afterwards for discussion, we move straight on to the EBRD, the largest investor in Kazakhstan outside of the extractive industries and a major supporter of renewable energy in country. So we turn to Aida Siddiqova, the Director of Energy and Natural Resources for Russia, Caucasus, and Central Asia. Aida.
Thank you, Katulis. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please let me set the tone maybe with some observations, numbers and facts that are very relevant to the context of what EBRD is doing in the renewable sector in general and in Kazakhstan in particular. Over the course of human history, we saw a number of wholesale energy revolutions. We saw a shift from wood to coal in the 19th century. We then saw oil and gas taking over in the 20th century. But nothing compares to the fast pace of the renewables revolution that we are seeing now. 90% reduction in cost of solar over 5 years, 50% reduction in cost of wind. The pace is unprecedented. It is perfectly plausible that we're at the beginning of another era, that there will be another technology coming in online that will change the landscape completely and will have further tectonic shifts, say if storage facility becomes commercial for renewables. Climate change, as the previous speakers mentioned, is a major challenge for the planet, for all of us. So in 2015, the bank launched the Green Economy Transition, or what we call GET approach. And that puts investments with environmental benefits at the heart of our mandate. Preserving and improving the environment are central features of a modern, well-functioning market economy, and therefore key goals of the transition process that the EBRD was set up to promote. We are also a major financier of climate change mitigation and adaptation in our countries of operation. Since 2006, the bank has invested 22.2 billion euro in over 1,200 green projects, including almost 2 billion in Central Asia, and resulting in 85 million tons of CO2 emissions reductions across our countries of operation. This equates to approximately a quarter of the total annual CO2 emissions for Central Asia. We are also, in addition to the green economy transition, we are supportive of Kazakhstan's national strategy, which is called Green Economy in particular. In that respect, in December last year, our board of directors approved a 200 million euro framework for development of renewables, specifically in this country, to support about 300 megawatt of new capacity. We believe the framework will be a big step towards meeting the country's commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions under the Paris Agreement. It will help to establish the market for private developers of renewables, and we, of course, anticipate a significant portion of co-financing. So it's not just us, but other IFIs, commercial financiers, and sponsors stepping in and pushing forward the renewables agenda in this country. Once all projects under the framework come on stream, we expect annual CO2 emissions to reduce by about 600,000 tons. And moreover, will hopefully substitute some carbon-intensive power generation in the north of the country and reduce the power deficit in the southern regions of Kazakhstan. Given the gas abundance in certain areas of this country, it would come as a natural supporting mechanism for renewables development in the short to medium term. Gas could be a very useful, additional, flexible base load source to support renewables. So the bank remains the largest renewables energy financier to date here. We just signed extension, another 50 megawatt of solar capacity for Burne. This is in addition to the previous 50 megawatt. And it basically will make it the first largest utility scale PV power plant in the country and in the region. Apart from financing, we engage in policy dialogue and technical cooperation alongside our IFI partners, agencies and donors, where I believe we have to put probably better efforts in coordinating and trying to be complementary to each other and cooperative. The bank has learned, what we learned through our experience is that the renewable energy targets set by the governments are not achievable in the vacuum. They have to be developed alongside specific regulatory framework, allowing for adequate risk allocation between investors, financiers, and governments. This is critical. We also learned that the existing key barriers that we see in Kazakhstan, for example, certain shortcomings of the PPA power purchase agreements, FX risk, we know that until now has not been mitigated, and now it has a partial FX adjustment. We have shortage of long-term local currency financing as a key barrier. Of course, grid and infrastructure constraints. The current grid needs to be assessed and enhanced to integrate renewables properly. We see real and perceived risk for first movers, which we are trying to help to assess and to overcome alongside our financing. And we see that there's an externality cost with an abundant and cheap power generation source of coal, as well as lack of an appropriate carbon price. It has been challenging for private sector projects to internalize the environmental cost of using carbon-intensive energy sources. So what's the lesson of all this? Of course, we're engaging with the government, but what we learned since 2008, when the BRD signed the first Sustainable Energy Action Plan, we're an old-timer here. We signed Sustainable Energy Action Plan in 2008. Since then, it's been a very diligent work of us and other IFIs to push forward the sustainability agenda. So it's going to be a long-haul process. We have to be, it's important to be patient, persevering, but also ambitious. And in that respect, we really welcome the political will of the government to join the Paris Agreement, to support the 3% target by 2020, and further targets beyond 2020. So I'll finish here, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Aydar Kazibayev, Managing Director of Astana International Financial Center. And
we have to give some time for some questions for auditory. And as Governor Mr. Kalimbetov mentioned, together with BRD, we are developing the concept of green financial system for Kazakhstan, which will be presented during the expo here in Astana. We have finished the first phase of the concept, which included the analysis of international experience, best practices, potential of financial sector for implementation of the Paris Agreement. And also we surveyed the interest of international investors. Second stage is almost finished. We will elaborate the economic models, develop a legislative base, draft model and a roadmap on green financial system. The workshop will take place in September at Expo. The concept of green finance system for Kazakhstan includes development of finance instruments such as green bond, green credits, emission trade scheme at the AFC exchange. Currently, we at the AFC are working on the adaptation and appropriate legal and regulatory framework to support the development of modern and efficient financial center in line with the best international practice. We are soon launching the new Astana International Exchange together with Shanghai and Nasdaq. The plan is to support not only traditional equity instrument, but green finance related tools as well. The choice of pursuing this particular product is far from random. Today's statistic of green bonds issuance brings me to the point that this is the most effective financial tool of financial stability worldwide. According to the recent Climate Bonds Initiative report, the green bonds portfolio amounted to $81 billion worldwide last year, and the estimated amount for 2017 is $150 billion, which is almost twice bigger and a significant indicator. Moreover, green bonds are issued not only by banks and private companies, but also by government and local authorities. The IFC is collaborating with municipalities in order to issue green bonds using the trading platform of the IFC exchange. For example, we were starting joint project with municipalities from Almaty and Astana, and we look after relevant project for financing ecological project. And one positive thing is that funds attracted by municipal green bonds will be directed to finance city needs, such as providing clean water, water management, energy saving, etc. Another positive moment of issuing municipal green bonds is reducing allocation from the state budget and financing big public project. This instrument, as well as emission trading scheme, will be introduced at the IFC Stock Exchange by the end of this year. It's our project, and we will, together with our steering group, will work out some instrument and procedures on the second stage of the joint project. We have even launched greenfinance.kz, a web page dedicated to this project, which in the future will become an online platform for the discussion around green finance. So, dear friends and colleagues, from a personal and subjective point of view, Astana can become the right place to discuss these trends, while IFC will be the right place to finance new energy projects. We are going to continue joint project with the EBRD, and we would like to serve our team, our working team. So let me express gratitude to preparation of this session to the Ambassador of European Union, Mr. Trajan Christea, and our team from EBRD, Mr. Jan Willem, and Jürgen, Chris, first of all, Katlos Helmer for preparation of this our session. And I think that we will continue the discussion and other panels, maybe, or framework, Astana Economic Forum today and after day. So, thank you very much.
We do have a few minutes left for discussion. I'd like to bring in the audience as far as possible. So, if you have a question, please make yourself known. We have our roving microphones. I'd ask that you just introduce yourself before posing the question. I'll kick it off, though. One topic we haven't really talked about, although I mentioned, is carbon markets and Kazakhstan's emissions trading system. Putting a price on carbon, as we know, is an effective means to accelerate the transition to a low-carbon economy. So I'd like to pose this question to EBRD, and I think we have EBRD's head of carbon markets here, Jan Willem. So I'd like to ask Jan Willem, what are some of the key lessons learned from the first phase of Kazakhstan's ETS, and what to do to ensure the next stage can be successful?
Kazakh ETS started a while ago and has been postponed to restart on the 1st of January 2018. Let me say Kazakhstan was the first Asian country to initiate this carbon pricing, and I think it should be commended for that. There are now other Asian countries like South Korea, China, and other trading schemes under establishment. And I think if Kazakhstan restarts on the 1st of Jan, then of 1st of January next year, then it can resume its let's say regional leadership on this issue. As to why the system stopped, there were, let's say, I think the system was implemented very quickly. On one hand, that's good. On the other hand, it led to a number of weaving faults, which hopefully will now be addressed by the administration. Amongst others, weaving faults relating to the MOV of the installations, the trading platform, etc. And here is, I think, also where we see a role for AIFC. So I think it is important for Kazakhstan to resume that pathway, to put a price. Will probably at the beginning be not a very high price, but over time the price can increase. And our economic modeling with consultants have shown that for Kazakhstan to meet its Paris Agreement, it needs carbon pricing, it needs an ETS in order to achieve its goal in a cost-effective way. Thank you.
I think when we talk about financing, long-term investors are needed. In Kazakhstan, lack of long-term, such as pension funds and insurance, are the major sources of financing. So when we talk about green finance, we have to also talk about supply of funding from various countries. So how could we develop those pension funds and insurance and long-term institutional investors in Kazakhstan would be very important. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Perspective, we would welcome anything, basically. Local currency, long-term 10-year financing that is suitable for the long-term nature of the renewable projects is lacking. So if pension funds or insurance companies could become the providers of that financing, we would only welcome. But I would also like to know that the newly created AIFC could play a critical role in arranging that. The bank on its own is working hard on creating instruments together with the National Bank of Kazakhstan and commercial banks in creating local currency bonds, potentially CPI-linked bonds. But again, it takes more than one institution, and I completely agree with a colleague from ADB. Pension funds and insurance could be a good and appropriate source, but maybe colleagues from AIFC and other institutions could there.
I think Simon has, and Ian has.
Institutional investors are a hugely important source of potential financing for long-term infrastructure, and it very much suits their mandate of having to deliver returns over a long period of time, which fits with infrastructure investments. Clearly, domestic finance is going to take time to grow as the financial sector deepens. One interesting thing is that the institutional investors seem to play a different role to other actors in the system. So some of the major commercial banks might be better placed to take the initial risk of projects, and then the institutional investors come in behind and take stakes in those projects when they're operational, freeing up the bank's capital to be recycled through new projects. So they are a very important part of this story, but we'll need to develop the domestic side alongside with the financial centre, and in the meantime, I guess some of the risk reduction instruments that, such as guarantees or political risk insurance and so on, some of those mechanisms can perhaps over time tempt some of the foreign institutional investors to make investments also in Central Asia. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks. These aren't necessarily solutions, but I think they're interesting topics to bear in mind related to sort of fintech or the broader digital finance space, which I know is of interest to AIFC. So the first point is, in November in Singapore, there's something called a hackathon, where you put out a problem and you try and get the digital community to address it and come up with innovative solutions. And we know, and we've discussed this morning, that currency hedging costs are a prohibitive factor in sort of getting long-term cross-border institutional investments. And one of the problems that's been put forward in this hackathon is there a way to use cyber currencies to somehow reduce or potentially eliminate the hedging costs associated with cross-border flow? So I don't know if the answer, if it's possible, but even if it is in a slight way, it could have huge implications. The second example is one from Kenya, where I think in April, Kenya did something quite innovative using their M-Pesa platform, which is a very widespread mobile phone-based transactions payment. And they actually issued an infrastructure bond where you could only subscribe to it through mobile platforms. So this does a number of things. It opens up a whole new investor base. The transaction costs are very, very small. I think you could invest down to maybe $2 or $3 equivalent. It increases the savings rate, et cetera, and it allows you to leapfrog financial infrastructure that potentially doesn't exist. So as I say, it doesn't completely answer your question, but I think there are two interesting innovations in a space that AIFC is going to be examining going forward that could help contribute to reducing some of the barriers to long-term investment.
Thank you, Ian. The role of technology is obviously an important topic. I don't think we have enough time to cover what AIFC's plans are in terms of stimulating long-term capital, possibly leveraging the Central Pension Fund.
Bank and government work out some joint project for using local currency for supporting not only green finance but all national economic project. So And please cut words for our guest. Please, you see brochure booklets. Please take with please see, and at our we prepared for this session. Please feel to take with you.
Thank you.
Project which has been made together with EBRD has been mentioned, and I would like to ask panelists what are the next concrete steps with regard to building the green investment infrastructure as a piece of IFSC business. Thanks.
On the sort of EBRD part of the equation, we certainly, in terms of next steps, we can see we have the whole pipeline. As I mentioned before, we have 300 megawatt to build across the next 5 years. So hopefully there will be more burners in different sizes and shapes, and not just solar, but wind as well. Financing is a critical part of it. We hope there'll be more financiers in the process, and AIFC would certainly probably be best placed to do that through a range of instruments. Green bonds were mentioned, certificates. So we hope to see as costs are falling of the equipment, as costs are falling, as technology costs are falling, we hope to see financing reflecting that and becoming more available and cheaper. So that's for the next steps.
So the main task of IFC is create supporting infrastructure for green finance instrument, for green finance players. It's only because, for example, we will launch it as an IFC exchange, and at present time we has launched regulatory for IFC. So we present time remain our task to launch it in supporting infrastructure.
And which has been mentioned, which is led by EBRD and AIFC, and we're fortunate to have Simon join our advisory group, as well as Simon Zadek from UNEP, who couldn't be with us today. I suppose the purpose of the project is to capture the essence of the old saying that nothing succeeds like success. And so our task is really to help lay out a roadmap for Kazakhstan to capture some of these ideas that we've touched upon today and put them into concrete action. We've developed a model and a number of recommendations which we'll be going through tomorrow morning at 9:30, and look forward to the second phase of the project. So in summary, I think we covered a very, very broad territory today. It's heartening to hear that the commitment is strong. There are a number of tools and mechanisms that important international partners are deploying and plan to deploy over time. And although the future is possibly uncertain, there are some streaks of sunshine coming through the cloud. So I thank all of the panelists, and importantly, I thank all of you for your time and questions. Thanks very much.
Yes.